Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, your RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support in our recent content. Like we said last time, the playoffs are fast approaching, so we're kind of just going to look around at every single game that's pretty much occurred that have some interesting ramifications on the standings and the playoffs as well. Also, once again, thank you for hitting the huge milestone with us of 50 subscribers. Our next goal is 100 subs. So please, before we get started with today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
So, we're just kind of now, again, we're getting close to the end of the season.
Yeah.
Most teams, again, have, around 10, 11 games left in their regular season. So, now we're kind of just going around kind of getting to take a look at, where a lot of these teams, are at this point, in terms of a lot of the games. I guess we'll kind of look at, the ones from Monday onwards. Right, not all of them, right? Because some of them don't really have ramifications, right? Like the Nets and the Raptors don't really have too many ramifications there, right?
Sure.
Celtics Hawks, that was a blown 30-point lead by Boston, but Boston has pretty much clinched up the 1 seed. So not really much there. We had, a couple of games here, right? So, obviously the Suns Spurs, right? That was a game where, no Wemby, right? So it was kind of a game where ideally you would have liked to have won that, if you're Phoenix. But they did lose. It was a Jeremy Sohan game-winning three,
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It was.
yeah. And then I think Beal and Nurkic got hurt like in the fourth quarter, so they didn't get a chance to close. So that was a bad loss. They made up for it, however. They got the win over the Nuggets. That was a game in which Jamal Murray didn't play, so it's kind of hard to have some, big picture takeaways from that game. But the race is on. Essentially, in that 7 to 10 spot, right? Because again, you look at the Mavs, the Suns, and the Kings, right? Obviously, if you go, into that Mavs Kings matchup, right? The Mavs blew out the Kings, right? So they're trying to separate themselves. But in the case of the Suns, right? They have the hardest remaining schedule of anybody remaining in the NBA. I think they were also kind of saying like in terms of like win percentage of the teams they're playing, like the combined, I guess, percentages of all of them is like makes it the toughest ending to a schedule in a very long time,
Okay.
right? So that's kind of a rough stretch, right? We look at the next, several games, right? At OKC, at New Orleans, then 4 home games, right, against the Cavs, Timberwolves, then New Orleans, then a back-to-back against the Clippers, one at home, the other in LA, then Sacramento on the road, and then finally on the road against Minnesota. So these are all playoff teams. These are all teams that are trying to, you know, make a push for some spot in the standings as well, right? Like say New Orleans, right? They're not locked in, right? They're kind of going back and forth with the Clippers, right? Same with the Clippers who've kind of slid as of late. Cleveland, Minnesota, New Orleans, same thing, right? Minnesota. I mean, like that's the kind of the thing here is that for Phoenix, you need to win most of these games, right? I think you need to like pretty much go above 500 at minimum.
Yeah.
Because or else they're going to be in danger of sliding, right? Obviously, of the teams below them, right? Only the Lakers, I think, have the tiebreaker against them, right? So I don't think the Kings have the tiebreaker against the Suns because I'm pretty sure the Suns beat them 2 or 3 times. I guess they play them one more time, so that could have some implications, at least in regards to you hang a loss on one and then you get a win on the other. So that's kind of the danger, right? Obviously, they were able to kind of get a cushion, right, with the Nuggets win, right? So that kind of, I guess, makes it a wash between like you lost to the Spurs, but you did get a win against the Nuggets, and that's better than losing both. If you lost both, right, then you'd be in a real bind because then you have only one more loss than or one less loss than LA. You'd basically be a game back, and they have the tiebreaker, and they have a easier-ish schedule than Phoenix. So they kind of need to figure some stuff out, here because again, they're playing a lot of quality teams. They are 6-4 in their last 10, but it still feels like a lot of uneven basketball. So they're gonna have to kind of kick it into high gear. And the Spurs game to me was the one that was kind of disappointing, just because, that was the game where up until the fourth, right, they were pretty healthy.
Yeah.
Um, and then they just lost to a shorthanded Spurs team. Again, you got a good break, without Jamal Murray and the Nuggets, but you got to take these games seriously.
Yeah, I agree it wholeheartedly. And it's like, I don't know about you, but I'll open up the question to you in a second. But I think Phoenix
Yeah.
is probably the team in the West that's playing with the most fire at this point. Maybe outside of like Golden State, because it all goes back to the fact, like we both agree that Phoenix is too expensive to be in the play-in. Like we know they're also too talented on that upper echelon tier of talent where three of those guys should not be competing in a play-in spot, and that's kind of the problem. And like you said, the offense sometimes looks janky. They don't look cohesive, and I guess that's due to the fact that they haven't played a whole bunch of games healthy and all together. And I'm gonna, go ahead and say, like, also at the beginning of the season, they had a rough start, considering, not necessarily like in the wins columns, but I guess in terms of the play style. It just didn't look like it was being put together properly. It doesn't look like a properly constructed team, and I think it still doesn't look that way. They still need like some more structure, and I think that's the thing that they're missing. You have guys playing out of place. You have some guys who are kind of unreliable and probably wouldn't be getting minutes on another team, playing heavy minutes, in rotation on this Phoenix team. But yeah, I would say like, of the teams in the West, which ones do you think are like playing with the most fire right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing where you kind of mentioned with the Suns and Warriors, where it's like, what do you do if you miss the playoffs? I guess, if you're the Suns, because you have the factor of like, we still have Booker, we still have Beal, we still have Durant. We weren't healthy, for stretches, so maybe we
Yeah,
just kind of bank on maybe we have a healthier-ish season next year, swap the pieces around. It feels like Golden State. I mean, I guess to be fair, Golden State won a title 2 seasons ago, so it's not the same kind of pressure as the Suns have, where they haven't won as a core. I guess the big question for me is what does Golden State do? I guess we'll get into it, once we talk, about their team. But I think it's
sure.
probably, I would say, the Suns, the Lakers, and Warriors probably have the most fire. I don't think the
Hmm.
Kings have as much fire. I mean, they want to make the playoffs. Obviously, they don't want to miss the playoffs, but they don't have the same expectations placed on them,
Sure.
as those other teams, right? All three of those teams we kind of looked at as, you know, the crop below Denver, right? And so far, you know, I guess some of them have been playing better as of late, but at the same time, you still don't know. Come play off time, and again, not all of them are going to get in because we mentioned 10 teams, and we'll have it. We have an 11th one now that's possibly in play that we'll get into in a moment. But I think it's probably those three teams.
Sure.
Also, just because the star power, since it's led by some older guys, you know the ramifications of missing the playoffs, right? What do those teams do?
Right.
Um, and Phoenix, I feel like it may be like the toughest one to change, only just because like it's three max guys and then a couple other guys. But then with Golden State, you have their roster is super expensive as well, so a lot of those guys may just be kind of locked in. And then you have the trio together, right? But I would say those three teams.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fair. And like with the Warriors, the main reason I'm saying like it's probably Phoenix, above them is like you said, it's three guys. They're super expensive team, but then with the Warriors, it's more so like we kind of expected this to happen where, we kind of expected the decline to happen. Maybe not this early and this soon in terms of, where they are in the standings, but, I think there's a lot more pressure on Steph himself and like what it's going to do for his legacy. Like, will Steph ever win another ring? Same with like LeBron on the Lakers. Like, that's kind of the way that I think about it. And like, I feel like the Suns kind of have a lot more to prove, maybe than, the Lakers and Warriors. But for sure, I think, they're all playing with fire because they're all in the bottom 10 area. So, hey, it is what it is. I just don't think like I feel, sometimes I just look at the teams and I'm like, how are you in the play-in? But then I also look at the teams above them and I'm like, oh, that's also why they're in the play-in. Like, it's a matter of consistency, and like they've been the most inconsistent teams in the West at the moment. But then also like the teams above them have been very, very good. Because I think if we look at like even like the East, like the Lakers would be a lot higher than they are right now. In the East, if the Lakers were in the East, they'd be like 5 or 6. But that
Right.
just goes to show you how competitive the NBA is
Yeah.
at the moment. So that's what all it really is, I think.
Right. In the West, I mean, they are 9 games above 500. You
Yeah.
look at Phoenix, they're 13 games above 500,
Hmm.
and those teams are playing teams. Whereas, like you
Yeah.
said, if you're in the East, you're probably locked into that top six, and that's But we knew going into the season that the West was going to be a bloodbath, and that was before Memphis just kind of imploded,
True.
because and that's the other thing is that with those teams, if you go into next season, you're going to have some teams that are below them that will probably be better, right? Like I
Yeah.
would say, the Rockets, the Grizzlies for sure, because they already were a playoff team, assuming good health.
Mm-hmm.
And then even the Spurs, right? All those teams I would imagine would be better
Agreed.
than they were this year, right? Because they can add young talent, through either the draft or trades or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean that's kind of the intriguing thing. And then as we go on, we mentioned the Kings, right, where they got a couple where they had the win over the Sixers, right, and then they had the blowout loss to the Mavs, right, and that's been the thing with the Kings where they're 6-4 in the last 10, which is solid. Um, and again, Sabonis has been playing well, didn't play well against the Mavs. Um, and Malik Monk, I think him kind of not playing as well as of late, I think kind of hurt some of their offense.
Mm-hmm.
Defensively, they've been better, I think, because Herter's been out, but Keon Ellis is in there, and he's able to knock down jump shots at a relatively decent rate while being a much better defender. So I think that just kind of helps, balance out the defense for the Kings. But then, the issue with the Kings is that we still don't necessarily trust them come playoff time because they just haven't earned that yet, right?
No.
Like obviously, I guess, they performed better than expected against the Warriors last year in the postseason, but they were the higher seed, and they lost, right? So
Fumbled, bro.
that's kind of and that's kind of the tough part for them, where it's just again, even with Sabonis, we know he's a guy that plays very well in the regular season, but then last year against Golden State, he didn't play as well. And to be fair, he did have that hand injury where he had the wrap on it, for most of the season, right? And he's had a great season, that's better than he was last year, right? I mean, the scoring is kind of similar, but the efficiency from three is up, although
Mm-hmm.
he's not really shooting a lot. But he's also, career high in rebounds, career high in assists, right? 8 a game. And I think he's got the most double doubles in a season, basically, or consecutive double
Yes.
doubles or whatever.
He's
So,
been balling on
I
another
mean,
level. Like you can't hate on the
right,
Sabonis, factor.
right, exactly. So, and that's kind of the thing, with them. And then, you look at the Clippers, right? They had another kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing where they got blown out by Indiana in the second half, giving up 133, right? And then they had the win over the Sixers. Um, well, no, first they got blown out by the Clippers, then they got blown out by the Sixers, and then they played the Sixers again.
Yeah.
And then they ended up pulling off a comeback win of sorts, right? I mean, it probably shouldn't have gotten to that point, right? Because they were down for pretty much the entire game. They made a comeback late, right? Then Buddy Hield hit a go-ahead three. Then Kawhi got the 2-and-1s. Then Oubre, right? He drives to the rim. And Kawhi blocks the first one or wedges it or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the second one, right? They got the contest. I think it was Paul George, but then after the game, they basically said it was a foul. Right? Oubre was not very happy about the
Nah.
call. I mean, I guess like if he had done like a floater, right? They're just the time difference. It was kind of a tough shot to take, right? So you're kind of in a rough position where like sometimes the refs don't call those type of shots at the end of those type of fouls at the end of the game. You just never know.
Yeah.
But I don't know, because again with the Clippers, I know they won, but they just don't seem like the same team. I mean, they're 4-6 in the last 10. Could have easily been 3-7. And they're, if they slide a little bit more, right? They're only like a few games. I don't think they're gonna fall into the play-in, right? But like, you still have the issue of, they have 27 losses, New Orleans has 28, Dallas has 29, and they have, a tough-ish, close to the regular season as well, right? Where you look at their, remaining games, that they have the rest of the way. And who knows, right? Because this team has been pretty uneven. They've only beaten 2 teams above 500 since the All-Star break after playing great basketball. During that other stretch where they went 33-11 or 31-5, whatever it was. And again, their remaining games, right? You got Orlando, right, which is no slouch, although that's a winnable game.
Mm-hmm.
Charlotte, right? Charlotte's not very good, even though they beat the Cavs, right? Sacramento, Denver, Utah, right? So not that great. Cleveland, and then 2 games in Phoenix. It's a back-to-back. Then Utah, and then Houston. So kind of a, I guess mixed-ish schedule, sort of.
Yeah.
But they need to win again. kind of like Phoenix, they need to win most of these games because, this could be the difference between it could be the difference between, not just getting home court in the first round, but also like if you fall down to like 6, then you're playing a completely different team. And we still don't know what the seeding is going to be, right? Because it seemed like, the Nuggets might clinch out the 1 seed, and I feel like they probably will only because they have the easiest schedule. But it's still only by half a game. And then like Minnesota, who's been playing very well, right? They're 7-3 in the last 10. They're right there as well. So if you're the Clippers and you fall to 6, you could literally play any one of those teams in the first round, as opposed to being the 4 seed and having home court. So, they need to pick it up as well. And I just don't know what happened, right? Like, Westbrook came back. They still got blown out, in that first game. And then, they just barely edged it out against the Sixers in that game, which still is a win, big
Sure.
win. But, the defense mainly, I think, has been where it's really been bad. And maybe it's an old team, so maybe they're just not playing with the same intensity. I don't know. Ty Lue called them soft, which I feel like is never a good sign at this point in the season,
Yeah.
where guys literally have said like they don't know what their identity is. I don't know. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say it's fraud city because they did have a long stretch where they were really good, but I honestly have no idea. And if they do play New Orleans in the first round and Ingram's back, it would not shock me at all if New Orleans pulled off the upset.
Yeah, I think they're creeping into that territory, like you said, a fraud city where, you don't really feel too good about, how they played recently. Pre All-Star break, post All-Star break, the numbers are kind of wild to look at. The splits, they're 4-6 in their last 10. Ugly. Then that's plain and simple. Like you said, you never want your coach calling you out right before the playoffs start, pretty much. And, there's a lot of confusion. And they pretty much picked the wrong time to run out of gas at this point. Like you said, they might be, a team in the West also that's playing with fire, low key in terms of, the ramifications, because, they've got a lot of stuff to figure out in the offseason as well, considering what the decision with Paul George or whatever. But yeah, I mean, like, it's odd that they've played so poorly recently. But do you think it's like, well, what do you think is the factor? You think it's age? You just don't know? Because I'm looking at it more so like maybe they just ran out of gas.
I feel like they may have ran out of gas. I mean, this is the healthiest that those guys have been since they basically played together. And it is the oldest team in the NBA. But it's just so odd because there was a stretch where they looked like a team that was like right there, with everyone else, right? I mean, we saw them smash the Celtics. I mean, we saw them win again, like 70% of their games, for 3 months or whatever.
Yeah.
But since the All-Star break, it's just been trending in the wrong direction where they've only really been able to beat bad teams, right? I know Philly's record is above 500, but without Joel Embiid, they're not very good, right? So that basically is a sub 500 team.
Yeah. They beat Portland like twice before that.
Right. So exactly. Like, I mean, again, like since the All-Star break, their only wins, have been, the first one was Minnesota. Or I guess since, if you want to look at March, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's kind of really the point, like, right at the end of February where they really started to struggle.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even if you look at February, right, like after the All-Star break, right, because the Golden State game, I think, was the big win that they got right before the end of the All-Star break. Then like a loss to OKC, right? Win over Memphis. Not going to go over all of them, right? But, if you look at their wins, it's mainly against bad teams, right? A win over Memphis, a win over the Wizards. They did get the 1-point win over Minnesota. Then after that, right, Houston, where they were getting blown out and came back, kind of like the Philly game.
Mm-hmm.
A win over Chicago, 2 wins over Chicago, then 2 wins over Portland. And then this Philadelphia win without Embiid, which, again, is not a very good team. So, I mean, it's not a lot of impressive wins in there. And some of the losses were really bad, right? Like that Laker loss at the end of February, right? That was the one where they had the 20-point lead in the fourth.
Yeah, unacceptable.
Right? Like that one just, like I think Paul George was out in that game, but like still.
Can't blow leads
just,
like that, bro.
Right. And, like New Orleans, right? They had some games where they just kind of got straight up just dogged, right? Minnesota, that was the loss. That was the weird game where like Kawhi left after the first quarter. So you could at least say like, okay, that kind of probably threw everybody off the rhythm. They went from blowing out Minnesota to getting blown out. But, I don't know. Like that, it feels weird. I mean, again, it's maybe they've just ran out of gas. Maybe they feel complacent now, but I don't think you can get but so complacent because, again, the lower you drop in the standings, the less of a chance you have at getting out, of the West. Because I mean, again, I know we saw Miami come out of the East, but in the West, who came out the 1 seed. So I mean, if
Yeah.
you're not a top 3 seed, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to get out of there because you're just going to be playing a tougher opponent, earlier. And I don't know.
Yeah. They're in such a weird
Right.
spot. I don't know.
And even with yeah, and with Westbrook, like that's an energy guy, so that does help. But it's still not something where it's like defensively you're not significantly better. I don't feel like with Westbrook out
Right.
there. Like
Agreed.
I think that's more so just like I know he can get rebounds and he can get stops because he's very strong. Isn't just going to get mismatched that easily, but still like that
Consistently?
doesn't
No.
right that doesn't solve all the problems. So that's the issue. So and
Yeah.
I'm and there's not really anyone else that they're kind of just waiting for to come back. So I honestly have no clue. I mean, I feel like some of it is it would also just be nice if you had another forward option next to Kawhi and Paul George, but they never had that. I guess it was supposed to be Tucker, but he seemed like he might just be cooked. So I mean,
Yeah. I don't even think
really,
he hasn't played in forever, right?
like he's only played sparingly, and like they've kind of tried to play him in some of these games, but he hasn't really been all that productive. So I mean, like that's kind of the issue
Yeah.
where it's like, even last year he was okay for Philly and he was starting.
Yeah.
Um, because he had a couple of games, like even this month, he played like, 26 minutes against Portland, but it's also Portland. So it's like, who cares,
Yeah.
right?
Agreed.
Played 12 minutes against the Pacers, minus 14. And like they've tried to do some of these small lineups where he's out there. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So if they had another option to kind of turn to, where, if you didn't trade all of your forwards in the Harden trade and you kept like maybe one of them, that might be where that might help a little bit. I'm not saying it would save the season, and I'm not even saying it's a lost season, but that may be another thing that they might just be missing. Because against a team like New Orleans, you need somebody like that. Because I think it's not necessarily a great ask to say like, "Hey, Kawhi, you were going to guard Zion for most of the for most of the game and most
Right.
of the series." Because who else do they have? It can't really be their bigs because they're too slow. They
Yeah.
can meet him at the rim, but you know we've seen people try to, and that's probably the best way to beat Zion is to put a big guy on him. But the
Yeah.
big guy kind of has to be able to move with him,
Yeah.
as
Got to
opposed
be
to
able to
just being
rotate your hips, slide your feet, and a lot of bigs can't do that, especially in the modern NBA. Like, which is crazy to even think about, considering who we have. But
right. Their bigs, yeah, their bigs, I
yeah.
think are a little bit, slower, and then like a Tice, I guess he's strong, but still,
Bro,
that's the tough.
he's probably going to get bullied by Zion. Like Kawhi, I would love to see like the matchup between Kawhi and Zion, where it's like Kawhi takes him on the perimeter. But I mean, as soon as he gets in the paint, I don't really think Kawhi stands a chance, if I'm being honest.
Right. And then again, and then uh, looking at a couple of teams that are going the right direction, right? So that's New Orleans and Dallas, right? So New Orleans, as we speak, right, they're playing the Bucks right now. It's in the fourth. They're up, by double digits. That I think Lillard got hurt and came back. But still, like they're 7-3 in their last 10, maybe 8-2, right? So even without Ingram, they've still been able to, pull out some of these wins,
Yes, sir.
right? And that's kind and I think like we talked about, right? That's kind of where the depth comes into play, right? Where a guy like a Trey Murphy can just slide in and he can basically be, another guy,
Hmm.
that you can put out there and he fits well with Zion because he can shoot, right? He's athletic, he's got length. And then other guys, right? Like, in the second halves, right? They kind of do different things, right? Where Valanciunas kind of starts the game, but like Larry Nance Jr. a lot of times will be out there later in the game. They even have Point Zion. We've seen that at times, right? There was a game, I think it was one of the Clipper games, right, where um one of those guys was out. I think it might have been McCollum, and they just, let Zion run point, and they basically put all the other guys out there like Herb
Yes.
Jones, and Trey Murphy and others. So, that's nice that they have a lot of options, right? They did lose, the other night to Oklahoma City, right? And that was a game where they were getting blown out, came back, and then, they had a lead, but they couldn't close it. And that's, that is a concern for New Orleans because they do have some of these games. It hasn't happened as much of late, right? Because a lot of those other games were earlier in the season where they would have double digit leads and then blow them. Um, but they've been better with it as of late. But I think the main thing for them is if you get Ingram back, that's where you're going to be in a really good spot. You just hope he can come back in time. At least maybe a little bit before the playoffs.
Yeah.
They do have some other tough matchups, right? Like after the Bucks, they play Boston, then they play Phoenix, then they play Orlando, then they get a break against the Spurs, then they play Phoenix again, then Portland, you get a break, then Sacramento, Golden State, and the Lakers. So um, if you could get Ingram back, you know, maybe the last week of the season, that might help. Who knows? Because again, he's going to be reevaluated, I think, in like a week or whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's his return date. So,
Sure.
we'll have to see. But New Orleans been really good, and again, whereas the Clippers picked the wrong time, to not play well, right? The Pelicans are kind of peaking
Yeah.
for the most part, and that bodes well for them in a playoff series. Where again, if they play the Clippers, like they're not going to be looked at as the favorites, but they're going to have a good shot because they've been playing really well. You're getting the best version of Zion compared to what we saw earlier in the season. We already know Ingram was playing well before his injury. So I'm feeling really good about that team,
Yeah, me
especially
too.
compared to what it looked like after that in-season tournament debacle.
Yeah, I've been like thoroughly impressed with how they've kind of turned the narrative around on themselves, and it's really fascinating to see because I think this is kind of like they're showing flashes of the New Orleans Pelicans, years ago that we thought they could be, potentially, considering all the young talent that they've cultivated, the depth that they have. Zion actually playing phenomenal. I think they're on the rise. Looking at Zion's numbers specifically. I'm not going to say like they're the best, but they are pretty good. In terms of 22 points per game, 5 rebounds, five assists. He's doing better efficiency wise than he was earlier in the season. Not as well compared to last season, but earlier in the season, it was looking kind of rough. Where people were talking about moving on from him, which is so wild. But regardless, looking at just their overall team play, it's cohesive. It's the polar opposite of the Suns. They look like they have a developed system. They look like something is going on. They run their plays, they execute. And they're really good on both ends of the floor, which is the thing that I find fascinating. You don't really see that a lot. But most of the top teams in the NBA right now are pretty good on both ends of the floor in some regard, in some respect. It may not reflect in the defensive ratings, but at least one aspect of their game on each end of the floor is pretty good. So it's nice to see the New Orleans Pelicans actually be, above average in both of those categories. And, they're fighting for a spot. And, I think, respect needs to be put on their name to the point where, I think right now they're probably better than the Clippers, in terms of the level of play that is. So like you said, if it does come down to, the standing staying the same, I wouldn't be surprised if the New Orleans Pelicans actually beat the Clippers in like a 7-game series.
Right. Yeah. And then, the Mavs, right? We mentioned their, blowout win over the Kings, right? That's a big, game, that has standing implications, right? Because I think the Kings were ahead of them before that game, right? The Mavs, right? They're 9-1 in their last 10 games, right? And they've really kind of started to put themselves in a really good position where they may actually be able to avoid the play-in, which I think is the most ideal scenario, right, for them. Because, obviously, you factor in how competitive the West is. You don't really want to be in the play-in. And, for them, they've basically played the best basketball of the play-in teams. And again, at the right time, right? Luka and Kyrie, now the pairing, compared to last season and earlier in the season has been way more successful. The bigs, right? They've helped out, right? Gafford gives you some more rebounding and physicality, lob threat, kind of some of the lively stuff, but just with more strength,
Yeah,
and just seriousness, I guess. Not in a bad way, but you know what I mean, just in terms of just
I agree.
a little bit more veteran laden, right? PJ Washington starting to shoot better. He was terrible shooting the ball for most of his time in Dallas, but it's gotten better. His defense, I think, has helped out too because he can kind of guard multiple positions, and it's been better defensively than it is in Charlotte, which is kind of a, kind of just a thing where when you put a guy in a role that he's probably better suited for, right? Good things oftentimes can happen. And now if you're Dallas, right, again, we talked about if the Clippers slide, or if Dallas just keeps winning and they kind of just catch up, right? Then it's like, what if we got Dallas and the Clippers, in a playoff series, right? Let's say like Dallas maybe just wins at a better rate than New Orleans because their schedule's easier.
Mm-hmm.
And then they get the 5 seed, and then they play the Clippers in the first round, and we get another Clippers Mavs series. Except this time you got Kyrie and Luka, on one side, and then on the other you have Kawhi and Paul George, but also Harden, and then I guess Westbrook, and that would kind of be an intriguing series.
Mm-hmm.
But either way, if you're the Mavs, right, you still feel really good about the position you're in because again, the defense is, I don't think it's ever going to be great, but at least it's better than what it was before, right? If you can get to at least close to average, I guess, That would probably help.
Yeah,
But, either way, I just think with the personnel, it's probably not going to be like quite that, maybe close. But I think with the offensive firepower and the fact that you have, a top 5 player who's pretty much kind of a lock to put up, like what is the average? Like 30, 10 and 10 or whatever, close
pretty
to
much.
that.
He averages a 30-point triple-double right now. A little bit
Yeah,
under in
basically.
terms of the point, like, the point
Right.
ones and the point eights, but, it's around
Yeah.
33, 9, 9. Like, it's a
Right.
lot of, it's a
Exactly.
lot of stuff.
Exactly. So it's like you have that guy, right? Which again, some of the other teams, don't necessarily have, right? Let's say like a New Orleans, right? Even though Zion and Ingram are good, they're not Luca, right?
Yeah.
Even as good of even as good as Anthony Edwards is, right? He's not necessarily Luca either. So, you know, if they can kind of match up against again one of those non-Nuggets teams, right? You can say we have the best player on the floor. We have a really good number 2. Um, they can be explosive offensively at times where they can just kind of just run you out of the building on offense. And then in crunch time, they're pretty good because you have 2 guys that can pretty much go to wherever they want and score from wherever they want on the floor. So, this is kind of, I guess, compared to say a team like Phoenix where it's like, you have the scoring, but, Luka and Kyrie can do some other stuff, right? Like they're better playmakers. They can just, they can create for like especially Luca, right? He can create for other guys just because of all the attention he brings. And that's where if you're Dallas, where it's like, this could potentially be the team, of all the playing teams, maybe, where maybe you might feel the best about them. Again, who knows? Because again, after Luca and Kyrie, right? The talent kind of gets, there's a drop off, but they do play off of those guys pretty well. So, in a 7-game playoff series, if one of those guys gets hot, if you get like a hot version of Tim Hardaway Jr., or somebody else along those lines, maybe PJ Washington steps in and hits a few shots. I guess he starts, so not really steps in, but you know what I mean. That could swing a playoff series where if they play, a team like OKC or Minnesota, that could make a difference maybe.
Yeah, and it's like I'm looking at them now. Technically, they're not in the play-in. They are the 6th seed, which is kind of interesting. So they are on the climb, pretty much as you just said. They could be vying for the 5 spot. It's just a matter of if New Orleans hangs on. But I have a question. Do you think what do you think of Jason Kidd as a coach in terms of what he's been doing recently? Because I think, you do have to attribute some of the success that they've had recently, them being 9-1 to Jason Kidd, alongside the fact that their stars had played pretty much flawlessly in their last 10 games. And then also the role players have stepped up for sure. But I remember, we talked about our X factors, going into the playoffs and around the playoff push, and I thought that one of their X factors would be Jason Kidd, where, if he pulls together a smarter system, a better system, a more cohesive system around his 2 stars, we could potentially be looking at, the best version of the Dallas Mavericks. So what do you think of what he's been doing recently?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is kind of figuring out the rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I know that's kind of the generic response,
Sure.
that a lot of people will give. But, for Dallas, because of the fact that they have so many guys after Luka and Kyrie that are, solid but not necessarily great, it's kind of a matter of trying to figure out, I think, who fits alongside of them, right? Like, when they first got those guys, right, they were coming off the bench, right? Like Lively was starting, Derek Jones Jr. was starting with Hardaway, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but now both of those guys start. Washington and Gafford start. Lively comes off the bench, which for a rookie is probably better.
Yes.
And he can go against those smaller second units, and because he can run the floor, and he's a good athlete, you'll be fine.
Yes.
Because you're not normally going against super physical guys in the against second units.
Mm-hmm.
And then then also they're healthy now, right? Because that was a problem I think for a while where they had a long stretch where like one of Kyrie or Luca was out, right? Like Kyrie's missed some time, and then other guys missed stretches, right? Like a guy like a Maxi Kleba missed a ton of time. Exum, who was kind of a key guy for them earlier in the season, he missed a ton of time. Lively's missed time. So those are the biggest things is I think kind of figuring out the rotation and also just good health. I think kind of helps. And now that you have both of those things going for you, now you can kind of slot guys in. And, even a guy like a Josh Green, right? Like he's out. So that kind of, forces you to kind of make some more rotational changes, right? Because I think Josh Green was starting before he got hurt.
He was, I think.
So, but, that's kind of the thing, is that they do have a lot of different options. So that's why I think you do have to give some credit to him. But like I said, then you also have to factor in, again, now they're healthier, too, and they made some upgrades to the roster, right?
Yeah.
Where, it's like you had Grant Williams before, who I feel like is getting picked on a little too much. But, they did trade him, and then they got back, basically two rotational guys. I know Gafford was in a separate trade because it was the Wizards thing,
Yes.
but still, you got, two guys as opposed to, guys who were there before, like Seth Curry and Grant Williams, who are fine. But, I think the guys that they brought in give you more of what you would want.
100%.
So I think that's kind of the combination there. In addition to, I think, just guys getting more comfortable, because now Luka and Kyrie have played more games together. And so they've kind of figured out, I think now, because they're smart players, how to play off of one another.
Yes.
Right. And there's going to be stretches where it's like, okay, it's Luka's turn to take over. Right. Like I think against the Kings, Luka did almost all of his scoring in the first half. And then in the second half, it was mainly Kyrie, and then they put the game away at the end of the third. So, stuff like that, where it's just kind of like, I think, just being more comfortable. So it's a combination.
Yeah.
But I mean, everybody deserves credit,
For sure. Yeah, I think their synergy has been on just like a whole nother level. They've been really, really phenomenal recently, and
Right.
yeah, I think that they, if they do stay in this 5 or 6 range, I think they could be primed pretty much for a deeper playoff run than we initially thought. I think if they were in the play-in, we'd be kind of a little bit more nervous. We might, lean towards more of a first round exit. But I think, if you're a higher seed, I would kind of hope and expect you to, go farther than the first round.
Yeah. Ideally, if you're Luka, you don't want to have another season end relatively early, right? Because last year they didn't even make the play in. I know they kind of just sold the season so they could get the draft pick, but still, that's pretty rough, I would say, for that group of guys
Yeah.
to say, like, you couldn't even make the play in. And then this year, hopefully it's better than just a first round exit, because obviously they went to the conference finals, a couple seasons ago. And
Yeah.
since then, other than that, obviously you don't really fault anybody, because again, he was younger, right? So you don't fault him for going out in the first round of Kawhi and Paul George, but like missing the playoffs is pretty rough last year. So, if he can get back in there, we know he's a guy that if you get him in a playoff series, you're going to have a shot, because,
Yeah.
we've seen him in the playoffs and he is a legit, postseason performer, where
Yeah,
he's
he's
a guy
real.
that you can rely on, even more than, and again, it's kind of weird, right? Because, those type of guys where they have the ball in their hands a ton, usually those type of teams have a ceiling, right? Like, Harden was kind of like that,
Mm-hmm.
where he had a ceiling. I mean, to be fair, they were very close to taking out that Durant led Warriors team.
Yeah.
But Chris Paul got hurt. So, I mean,
What was it? And then I also choked with the 27, what was it, 27 missed threes or whatever?
Yeah.
L, bro.
Yeah. Right. So that's, but, and that's the thing, right? But, with Luka, I mean, he's really good. So, I mean,
Yeah.
he could be one of those guys that may be able to do it. Because even a guy like LeBron, until recently, had the ball in his hands most of the time, right?
Sure.
Like, the year the Lakers won the title, he was the point guard. But that's LeBron, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a different tier than, say, like a Harden, or like a 24, 25-year-old Luka, where,
Mhm.
Luka hasn't even reached his peak yet. So, because we already know this is like the best he's been. So, if you get this version of Luka, where it's like, he's even like a very high percentage 3-point shooter on high volume and on tough shots.
He's almost shooting 38% from the 3-point line.
Right. And it was higher earlier in the season, because he had a stretch where I think where he was hurt. So that kind of probably bugged him a little bit. But, that's kind of the thing for Dallas, where it's like, you have one of those guys. And if you have one of those guys and you can at least avoid the play-in, you have a real shot at making a deeper run, like you said, than what would be expected. Because I think going into the season, we thought they'd probably be a play-in team. But they may be able to avoid the play-in.
Yeah. I know this might be a little bit too early. But do we have any dark horses in the West? Because I would probably just stick with Dallas on this one, and that's pretty much the only reason I brought it up. But I didn't know if you had one like off the top of your head.
Yeah, I feel like Dallas, because of the way they've played, feels better. Maybe New Orleans could be one, just because
That's another good pick.
If they can be healthy, they may get further than we think. Second round is probably their ceiling, but. Again, I don't think people expect them to win a playoff series, in the first place. So, especially given how their season went earlier. So, who knows at this point?
Yeah.
And again, sticking with the West, right? We had other games, right? Like I mentioned, OKC and Houston. I guess we'll look at it from the Houston perspective first, right? Where they got the OT win, against, Oklahoma City. No Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, but as we already know, right, Houston is without multiple guys as well. So, you know, a really good win for Houston. And now they've won, 10 in a row, right? Which is kind of crazy to think where, a month ago, their season was pretty much over, right? And like not even that long ago, right? Şengün goes down, and we definitely thought their season was over. And then boom, all of a sudden, everything's clicking for them. Jalen Green every game, is just popping off, playing great. He was great in this game, not just as a scoring threat, but also like the fact that he was able to find guys, right? Because there were, stretches where he was like throwing, driving kick passes to like a Dylan Brooks or a
Yeah.
Jabari Smith Jr., right? So, and that's kind of what we talked about with Edwards, where it's like once you add that skill, that's where you become really dangerous, as a scoring, as a scorer is, once you get to a point where you can kind of use your threat as a scorer to make other guys on your team better.
100%.
And that's kind of the big thing for Houston is just the growth, that they've shown as of late. Again, I still don't necessarily know if they're going to be able to get in, right? Because, obviously Golden State got a couple of wins that kind of, hurts Houston's chances. Obviously, it's gonna be interesting, right? April 4th is when those two teams play, right? Tari Eason, he had the post, about coming out to play or whatever.
Hmm.
So kind of a message, I guess, to Golden State, which is
Even though
kind
he
of
hasn't
interesting.
played since January, which is wild.
His season is done, so he has,
Yeah.
so he's not coming back. But
Yeah.
yeah, just a lot of really cool things from Houston. Um, from that perspective, just the fact that Jalen Green's play, that's kind of the big thing. The fact that they're able to play up and down, and that these guys are more comfortable. And this is kind of like best case scenario if you're Houston, where it's like you get to end the season on a really good note, and feel really good about the guys you have going forward. Because remember, there was a time where we talked about, hey, could Jalen Green be a trade candidate, right? There was stuff, a thing that had come out recently about they were really close to doing something with Brooklyn where it was like Mikal Bridges. Um, and I think, whatever, I guess Brooklyn would get some of those picks back from Houston, for Mikal Bridges. And it's like, hey, Jalen Green's playing really well. So it's a good thing that they didn't give up on him because if
Yeah.
he can kind of carry this into next season, I mean, and then Houston adds some extra pieces, like, they could be a really competitive team.
Yeah. And it's like, looking at the roster, like you really wouldn't expect this team to be horrible. You would expect them to be, honestly, in my opinion, a little bit better than what they are. But, the injuries have happened. The inconsistencies also, hurt them as well. But they're so young. And I really do like a lot of the pieces that they do have. But, like, even a guy like Fred VanVleet, like, I think he's kind of been underrated this season. He's missed a chunk of time. Dylan Brooks was playing, fairly well earlier in the season. Has kind of like leveled out, but is still playing at a decent level to the point where he's helping you win games. But like you said, the
He's not
star,
shooting 30% anymore. He's
exactly,
not
yeah.
shooting.
Yeah, and like with Jalen Green, like he's the star of the show. Because I think their play is going to be contingent on if he can actually continue to pretty much average almost like 30 plus points per game on efficient shooting. Like that's the thing. But yeah, I think they're vying for this play-in spot. It's kind of wild that all of this hype, all this trash talk. Even Draymond was like, "I'm not worried about any Rockets." Like this is crazy. Like it'd be different if like this was the
That's,
1 seed. But
yeah.
bro, this is the 10th seed. I get it. There's like a lot of ramifications. This could affect the Warriors' legacy. It could affect what they do, in the next season or whatever. But it's a playing spot. But I do like the energy and the fact that they're hyping up this matchup. And like you said, I think it was April 4th was the date that they're supposed to play. So this should be a wild game. But yeah, I think what it was last episode that we talked about Houston and Golden State, and I think you were on you believe that the Warriors are probably going to stick with the 10 seed or, maybe get to ninth or whatever, be in the playing spot.
And it's only because, and to be honest, it's really only because they have an easier schedule, not because I think they're a significantly better team. It's
Sure.
just they have one of the easiest playing schedules, and Houston is one of the toughest.
Sure.
But, who knows?
Yeah, and I think that's a logical thing. But, like, I was more on the train of, like, Houston's probably going to take, the 10 spot away from them, which I think, they might be priming to do. It's just a matter of if Jalen Green can actually continue to play. Because I think, the moment he has a stinker, we can pretty much chalk it up to, it was a good run, but I'm hoping he doesn't have a stinker. Like, I want them to win because I've been like looking around social media too. A lot of people really are hoping for this Rockets team
I
to
think
kind of have their coming out party in the play-in.
I think the reason why, and we'll get into Golden. I guess well before we get into Golden State, just
Hmm.
a touch on OKC, right? Josh Giddey, he played very well the last
Sure.
several games. He's been shooting the ball much better. He's been scoring the ball. And a lot of those games were while Shea was still out there. Obviously, in a game like this with no Shea, you expect him to still. So that's kind of something to look at, right?
Hmm.
Where recently he has been playing better. Teams have been some teams leave him open a lot, and if he can make those guys pay, right, that could kind of maybe change OKC's fortunes because again, when he's out there, he can do some good things with the rebounding and the playmaking. And the size. It's just his minutes have been way down the season because he just hasn't been as effective. But back to the unless you want to comment on the Giddey thing before we go back to the
I mean,
these goals.
it's kind of just more so of like this is kind of what everybody wanted to see from him. This is kind of the level of play that I think he needs to play at if he wants to be a consistent, rotational guy for them. Because like we were talking about well, not way earlier, but like maybe a month ago, teams were giving him the Ben Simmons treatment, just kind of backing off and hoping and daring him to shoot. But now it's looking a little bit better. And this is a guy that does a lot. He gets rebounds. Pretty good for his position and size, but I think he still has a lot of upside. I don't think it's time to give up on him or anything like that. But yeah, shout out to him for having a pretty good game, even though they did lose.
Right, and then and then yeah, and then Golden State, right? They got a couple of big wins, right? They got the one over the Heat.
Yeah.
I know the Heat were without guys, so it's like okay, but still they got the win, and it
Yeah.
was actually competitive first. I think Miami led in the first half, and then Golden State pulled away in the second half.
Steph didn't play though, right? If I'm not
No,
mistaken.
he did.
Oh, he did.
He
Okay.
did. Yeah, he did. And then Draymond had the weird, funny play, I guess, with Patty Mills, right, where he'd like hold him down with the headlock or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Um, and then it carried over into the next game in a way, right, where it's like Golden State and Orlando, right? This is a big game, and then Draymond gets tossed like in the first 5 minutes, right? He's
Yeah.
arguing with the ref, about a call that doesn't even really impact him. It was about Wiggins. And he gets tossed, right? And obviously you have like the meme or the video or whatever of Steph where he just looks, kind of distraught and defeated, where it's like, come on, like we need you, for these games. They ended up winning anyways, right? Because Golden State, Wiggins, he stepped up big time. Because Steph really for most of the game didn't shoot very well. He made the 2 buckets late, but and he's been in a major slump as of late. But everybody else did just enough in this game that he was able to kind of pull it out and carry him home at the end, right? Orlando's offense was truly atrocious in the
Horrible.
first quarter. They had 11 points because I saw it. They
Yeah.
had like 6 points for most of the quarter. Not great process. Both of their best players were awful, and that's kind of the thing that kind of concerns me about Orlando in a playoff series, which is why I think they're a team where I think they're probably going to be a first round exit, even though they've had a really good season.
Hmm.
But
They have a ceiling.
I think
And it's
yeah,
defined.
but but it's just like, even with the Golden State wins, it still doesn't feel like a whole lot to write home about. Now, to be fair, Kuminga was out as well. He's been playing really well. So that's nice that you got to win over a quality team on the road. You have a lot of road games left, and they've been really good on the road. But I don't know. There's still, they've still been 500. They've been mostly healthy. I don't know. I think a big part probably of why I think a lot of people are rooting for Houston is also because I think people think it would be really fun to see like a young team, just kind of go in there with nothing to lose.
Hmm.
Kind of like I think last year a lot of people were hoping like OKC would get the 8 seed.
Yeah.
Because we hadn't really seen anything like that before, where it's just like a team of a bunch of kids and then they're in the playoffs, with nothing to lose. And I think also it's just like the vibes you feel like in Houston just are much more positive than in Golden State. Because even when Golden State wins, like I still don't feel like there's a ton of positivity just because I think going into the season, their expectations were so much higher. And kind of like the Clippers, not quite as bad, right? We're at a point where you're kind of supposed to be peaking. They've been kind of mediocre. Now, to be fair, now they've kind of reached an easier stretch of their schedule.
Hmm.
So that's going to help them out, right? Compared to, a team like Houston where they have a lot of really tough games. I mean, like, you look at Golden State's next few games, right? They play Charlotte and then the Spurs, right? Those are two basically gimme wins,
Hmm.
assuming you don't screw up. But then after that, then you have some big games where it's Dallas, and because sandwiched in between the Houston game is two games against Dallas, right? And those are important as well, right? Because again, if they want to move past 10, like you got to win all those games, right? And again, Dallas has something to play for because they don't want to fall back into the play-in.
Right.
Um, and you just don't know. So like that's kind of the thing. So not every game is easy. But that's gonna probably kind of determine their season. But I guess like, Golden State has a lot more at stake than Houston does. I mean, Houston, they don't want to miss the playoffs because they don't have their own pick, but it's also a young team. So it's like just the fact that they're progressing this way makes you feel better. But like if you're Golden State, what do you do if you miss the playoffs? Like, I mean, they have what, a $400 million roster. And if you don't even make the play in, I don't really know what you do after that. I mean, like to be fair, I don't think the math changes a whole lot if they got in and then still just lost in the first round because I just don't see a pathway for them to be able to advance, that far because the size thing I think is an issue. I mean, pick any of the top three teams, I think it would be a tough matchup. I mean, I think
Yeah.
ideally you'd like to probably play OKC, I guess, because they're a small team, as opposed to, because even like a Minnesota, I mean, like I know like they don't have like a Steph or anybody like that, but it just feels like that size and length. They have a lot of guys to throw at the Warriors, and I feel like that could really impact a team that small. Seems like Gobert's gotten better at playing against smaller teams this year, so I don't know. Like that's like I wouldn't really give them a chance in any of those first round matchups. And we still don't know who the one seed is, and if it's the Nuggets, definitely no. So I think that's part of why people are really rooting for Houston because it's just kind of the fun thing. Obviously if you're the NBA, you wouldn't feel great about Steph Curry being out of the playoffs, right? Because a lot of the playoff games that he's been in, have been some of the most viewed games this season, right? Like
Yeah.
their regular season games, like the ones against the Lakers, those, got or amongst like the highest viewed games this year,
Hmm.
right? And so if he's just not there at all, there's probably going to be some viewers that just won't tune in. Um, which, it still kind of sucks because there's still a lot of really good teams and players, but it is kind of something to think about. But I do think that there are a lot of people rooting for Houston, especially because again, it just feels like a more fun team right now. It doesn't really feel like Golden State's having fun. Like fun is
Yeah.
not a word that I would use to describe how that team is right now. Like I know they're probably happy that they've won a couple of games, but like I mean,
Yeah.
this being a 10 seed was not their expectation going into the season. I
Yeah.
am
Clearly.
positive.
Yeah, like the vibe is like you said, they're winning games or they've won a couple of games, but like you said, the vibe is clearly off. Clay hasn't really talked a whole lot or gotten a whole lot of media coverage in a while, so I'm not really going to talk about him, but I think Draymond is like the biggest issue for them because we can all admit, they need him to win, and Steph is right. They need him. They need to do everything in their ability to keep him on the court, and for him to only be playing 4 minutes in a game that is pretty much a must win for them, that's not good for them as an organization and them as a team. It just messes everything up, I feel like, and you can really tell that Steph just looks really defeated. He's at his wit's end with everything, and he just wants to be able to win games smoothly and, not have to deal with any of the extra BS or the drama or anything like that. So, I do wonder what, their plan is going to be to kind of keep Draymond in check. I doubt that'll happen because, I mean, like, I don't know. The Warriors are such a hard team to talk about. Because, like you said, their expectation was definitely not the 10th seed. I think we were probably looking at more of not in the play-in at least, but here they are, and you can't really control that. But, the thing that you can control is to probably win out, and that's what they're probably going to be looking to do. It's just a matter of, can they win out at a better rate than Houston? And, they have
Right.
the schedule. The stars are lined up for them to actually do so. It's just a matter of
Right.
execution, and Draymond has to be on his best behavior, and everybody has to play well as well.
Yeah, and they still have to win out the other teams because again, they're
Yeah,
they're still 10. So that's
yeah,
kind of the issue there is that even if they're winning games, they got to hope that the teams above them, don't win games, right? Like you look at a team like say um the Lakers, right, where they
hmm,
had, one game in which LeBron didn't play, right? That's the Bucks game, right? The crazy Bucks game, that went to double OT,
yeah,
or whatever, right? And
yep,
then they have a Grizzlies game. The Grizzlies are bad, right? But without AD, the Lakers have only won, I think, one game, before that, right? So like, I'm sure there were a lot of people that would have probably kind of assumed like, hey, even without AD, like if AD doesn't play, even though it's the Grizzlies, like they could still lose, right? And they won both of those games. They've won 5 in a row. They're 7-3 in their last 10. And like that's the issue, right? Like if it's 9-10 LA, Golden State, I think you would feel you're in a better position if you're the Lakers, because it just seems like right now to me, I mean, maybe that sounds kind of homerish, but it seems like I would think they seem like the better team to me right now.
Yeah.
Like I mean, again, like even without AD, right? When you have a guy like a Rui, Hachimura who can pop off in some of these games, or even an Austin Reeves or D'Angelo Russell who's playing great. Um, it sounds like they're going to get Gabe Vincent back, relatively soon. I think he's supposed to come back as soon as Sunday. So that's another team where it's like if you're Golden State, you have to leapfrog them. I mean, LA's schedule is tougher, and they do play each other one more time. That could have massive implications, but you don't know, right? Because like of those 11 teams, right? Well, 11 isn't fair, but like of the playing teams, right? Like
Mhm.
Golden State feels like they should be the one that you're just the lowest on right now. Because I mean, again, Dallas isn't in the plan, but look at them, 9-1. Phoenix and the Kings 6-4. We'll see with the Suns because they have a very tough schedule. The Kings do as well. Lakers 7-3. Then you look at Golden State 5-5. Again, they're gonna be better because they have a couple of gimme wins, but they're still what they have 4 more losses than Sacramento.
Yeah.
Who's 8, and there's basically 10 games left. That's a lot of ground to cover, in that amount of time, right? A team like, same with Phoenix, right? They have 30 losses. Golden State has 34. Like that's really tough. Like I don't necessarily know if you're going to be able to do that. They'd have to win basically almost every game,
Yeah.
and they haven't shown to me at this point that they're really capable of doing that. Because again, it's not like they've had a ton of injuries. I know Steph missed a few games, but they've been pretty healthy this month, and they've been a mediocre team, right? So
Yeah.
it's like, well, whereas everyone else, in that mix has been a lot better. Even Phoenix, who had been up and down, I would still say is playing better basketball than Golden State. So, and then, even with LA, right? If all of a sudden, if you're Golden State and Gabe Vincent comes back and maybe Vanderbilt comes back, then you're in an even tougher spot if you're Golden State, right? Because like
Yeah.
that's the tough part.
Yeah, that's what that. I guess that's kind of what comes with being the 10th seed and having high expectations and just not being able to execute. But I don't know. I don't really foresee them going. If it comes down to like, say this is the plan right here, right? I don't think they're probably going to come out on top. If you want me to be real and honest, I just don't really see them winning a lot of their matchups. So I don't know. It's tough, but
Yeah,
regardless,
I just think the teams ahead of them are better. I mean, I
100%.
know because of the championship core, obviously you give them the benefit of the doubt, but I feel like somebody like me got into trouble with that last year, right? Because like I thought that they would be able to come out of the West, and
Yeah.
they did not. They did, I guess, kind of close out the season on an okay note, right? Because they were kind of up and down, and then they got to the second round, and it's not like they got just smashed. I mean,
Right.
like the Lakers were the better team, but it was a 6-game series. Although some of those games were just straight up blowouts, but then you had a few close ones. But
Hmm.
um, that's the issue, and it's just like, what's the method for Golden State to get better, right? Because that's the thing. It's like now Clay's back in the starting five, so I think it's kind of a desperation attempt because it's like
Yeah.
we talked about it, right? Like I just didn't believe, and Pods hasn't been playing as well as of late, but I just don't believe if they're gonna make a deep run, like it's not gonna be with Klay Thompson as a 6 man. It's gonna be with him, starting and closing games and just playing better.
Yeah.
It's just like then you need Kuminga to carry his regular season success into the playoffs on both ends of the floor, right? You need Draymond to keep his head in the game, and like that's a lot to ask out of a group that I don't think has really, to me, shown that they're capable of doing that this year.
Yeah.
At
Too
least to
many
me.
problems, not
Like,
enough solutions at this point.
right. Yeah. And then, we already talked about LA in the sense of they've been better as well, kind of like the other teams. So, we'll see where, this goes. And then if we head over to the East,
Hmm.
right, obviously Boston, they've clinched up the 1 seed.
Yeah.
They did lose while we were talking, in overtime to the Hawks, right? DeJounte Murray had 44 points on 44 shots,
Yeah.
but,
And a game
Steve
winner
Young
though.
is out. Yeah, I did hit the game winner 6 of 19 from 3, but still, right? Like, again, called out. I That's wild. I still can't like because we didn't see it. Like, like I think I saw the game winner. But it's just like taking 19 threes in a game is wild.
Yeah,
For one guy. But either way, I mean, like to be fair, they're shorthanded, so it's like who else is gonna take all those shots? You know what I mean? But
I get you
either way,
though.
it's like with Boston. Like this was, I think, with the first game where their starting five had just come back, right? Because they had a stretch where some of those guys were out. And again with Boston, stuff like this has happened. I mean, they have clinched up the 1 seed, so I'm not really concerned about it. Um, as of now, the Bucks now they've kind of started to play a little more uneven, right? They've had a long stretch where they've been playing some pretty good teams.
Yeah.
And they were kind of good for a little bit, and then they've kind of now had a weird slide, I guess. To be fair, right? They got, if we look at their last 10 games, they're 5-5, right?
Hmm.
So, then if you look at those 10 games, right, I think it was what, the wins over the Clippers, the Sixers,
Hmm.
Suns, the Nets, and OKC.
Yeah.
And then the losses, right, were against New Orleans just now, as we were talking, right? The Lakers in the double overtime game, right? And these two games, Middleton was back. So, that's that's kind of, obviously, he needs to probably get a little bit healthier, but we'll see. And then right, they lost to Boston. That was a game I think where Giannis didn't play.
Hmm.
Right, but they competed, so you still felt good about that one. And then a game where they got destroyed by Sacramento, right? So, um, and then they also had the other loss to the Lakers before that, right? That was the first one where it was D'Angelo Russell that had like 40,
Yeah.
points or whatever. So
Yep.
I don't know. I mean, again, not much has changed in my opinion on the team. Like, I still feel like that they're really good. I'm not calling them frauds at all, right? I know you're more like on fraud watch than
Yep.
me, but I still think they're really good. But I don't know, right? Because it's just like it really just to me kind of depends on, you know, Lillard and Giannis together, right? Because like Giannis has had a great season. You could argue this is like his best season or close to it. Over 30 a game, 11 rebounds, 6 assists. What is he shooting? Like 61% from the field, right?
Yeah.
Or something crazy like that. So, this is basically one of his best seasons, right?
Hmm.
Lillard, I think that's kind of the main thing where it's like, in some of these games, really good, right? Like he had that Clippers win where he had 41, and then another Clippers win, I think, where he had 35, and he and Giannis closed it out. But then you have these other games, right? Where it's like, say, the LA games where he was kind of inefficient, right? Like in that last Laker game, he hit some big shots, for sure, right? But then like you look at the efficiency, right? It was like what 9 for 29, 3 of 14 from three, and then that's not the bad part, right? Because like I remember in that Laker game, the thing that struck me was the defense, right? Where it
Hmm.
was like some of those Reeves threes that he was stepping into, he was wide open, and like Lillard didn't even try to contest those shots. Um, and that's just something to think about. Where it's like Patrick Beverly, he has a wrist injury that I think he's just going to play through. So they'll need some of his, I think, point of attack stuff. Um, and they have the size. So it's like, you're not really super concerned about, what does it look like when they're playing a big team? Because they are a big team. But, I just don't know. Because it's like if Giannis and Lillard play at an A+ level, that's probably good enough to get out of the East. Um, but is it enough against Boston? I don't know, right? Because I think they have a chance. And especially like to close out a game, right? Like a Lillard and Giannis duo. How does that compare versus Tatum and Brown, right? Because Boston at times in the past has been a little shaky. Obviously if they overcome it this year, then they'll be in a better spot. But I just don't know. But I do think the Bucks are really good. It's just you'd like to be playing a little bit better, but I don't. It's I don't know. It like, and then also some of it depends on like what happens with Philly and Miami, like because they those are playing teams, and either Boston or Milwaukee could play them in the first round, and that may make some things interesting. Not that they're going to lose, but say like Philly's healthy, like Embiid comes back and he's as close to healthy as you can get, then all of a sudden that's a much tougher first round matchup than if it's like you know the Bulls or the Hawks or like Indiana, or some other seed that would just be a lower seed.
Yeah. And it's like I'm still on fraud watch, like or they're still on fraud watch for me at this point. But I do have to admit, they have been better. Like,
Right.
Malik Beasley, he looks good. Damian Lillard looks good. Giannis looks amazing. Like it
Yeah.
does look a little bit better. Chris Middleton, I'm sure, just needs to get his legs back. But,
Yeah.
in terms of Giannis and Lillard, like the duo does seem legit. I just think it's more of a case like, I don't think this is the year that they're going to win a championship. I think, you need to give them time to actually look a little bit better because I'm telling you, I can just see it right now. I think they're going to self implode in the playoffs. I could just feel it. And then obviously, I don't necessarily trust Doc Rivers a whole bunch still. So I think that's also another factor. But you cannot take away from the fact that they actually have looked competitive and they've looked really good, especially in the East, considering who their opponents have been recently.
Right.
And the thing is, like, you have to give Damian Lillard his flowers because this is the first time in his career, pretty much, that he's played, second fiddle to somebody, whether the two guys want to admit it or not. They're always going to give the PR training answer in which oh, I'm not conceding or he's not conceding, whatever the case may be. But I think Damian Lillard has played his role, I think, to not almost perfection, but he's played a very key part in why they are this successful because this was the reason why they moved on from Drew Holiday to get somebody to take a load off of Giannis, in which Damian Lillard can score. Defensively, he's definitely not Drew Holiday in any way, shape, or form, but offensively, I think he brings a lot more to the game, and I think it can open up Giannis's game even more potentially in the playoffs. It's just a matter of will it actually work.
Right, and I think that's where him having a career year kind of comes into play
Mm-hmm.
because it's just Lillard is still a guy where he's still a really dangerous scorer, right?
Yeah.
Especially late in games, the Bucks have been good, in close games, in crunch time, so that's something you got to factor in. But it is something to think about because I just like he had a game against the Celtics, that was the one where Giannis didn't play, where he was still really good
Mm-hmm.
and had 30 points, despite the fact that you're playing against a team where they have big physical guards. They have long athletic wings, and they have a guy in the middle. I think there were some guys for Boston, I think, that were out, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. But still, that's kind of the team that that's their main competition, I think. But obviously, it could get interesting. I mean, after
Yeah.
that, right? I don't
Their
think the other
their bench is annoying. Like, can I just say that
right,
one more thing? Like, Damian Lillard and Giannis are not the problems. I think it's just a plethora of other things where you look at the depth. It's like okay, I guess somewhat. I just don't have a lot of faith in them, and obviously like the coaching. Like I think Dame and Giannis are like they're nowhere near the reason why they're on my fraud watch list.
yeah,
Just
I
wanted to
think
get
it's
that out
just
there.
I think it just feels like they're missing, you know, one player or two, in
Sure.
that rotation where they had that type of guy. Like you had, like a 3-and-D type guard, that's a little bit bigger, or like a three and
Yeah.
D wing that's, a little more athletic than like a Jay Crowder. I think that's kind of what you're looking at because it's not a very athletic team,
Right.
outside of Giannis. Um, and then, again, they don't have like a lot of great perimeter or wing defenders. But, again, if Middleton gets a little healthier, that will probably help.
Yeah.
Um, and then after that, right, like in the East, I don't really feel super threatened by any of those other teams. I mean, obviously Philly and Miami is always kind of just something because they've been hurt, especially Philly's been without Embiid. And you
Hmm.
do kind of wonder like he's supposed to be back, I think, in April. So, obviously if he comes back and he's somewhat close to what he was before, that could kind of shake some things up because then
Yeah.
it, presents a much tougher matchup in round one. Because it seems like they're probably just gonna be stuck in the play in. Obviously like it's not like they're that far behind, the teams above them, right? Like they're a half game behind Miami, although Miami has the tiebreaker.
Hmm.
And then they have one more loss than the Pacers, right? So they're like a game and a half behind Indiana. So it's not like they're that far back, but 6 is probably as high as they can go, right? Because
Hmm.
because Orlando has 30 losses, so they're what 3.5 games behind Orlando.
Yeah.
So with again like 10ish games to go, that's probably a wrap, because so that's those are probably going to be the playing teams unless Indiana just kind of implodes. Who knows? Because they've been
Yeah.
kind of up and down. 6-4 in their last 10, which I guess is fine. But
Hmm.
um, after that, right? I guess the Knicks they've been 8-2 in their last 10. Mitchell Robinson came back, so that helps. Um, because again, he's a guy that's been out for most of the season. And then if they can get back Anunoby and Randall, right? I think that's another team that could at least make some things interesting, right?
Yeah.
Especially if they keep the 3 seed because Cleveland has kind of slid. They're 3-7 in their last 10. They lost to the Charlotte Hornets. Um, unfortunately. But Mitchell's
Yeah.
supposed to be back, I think, this weekend. So that should obviously help Cleveland. We'll see, but I don't know. Like it feels like, your top 3 seeds are probably still gonna be Boston, obviously Boston, then Milwaukee, and then the Knicks. I mean, again, it's still close because now that Milwaukee has lost, a couple of games, here and there, and they're 500, whereas the Knicks are 8-2. They're only a game and a half up of the Knicks. So if the
Yeah.
Knicks can somehow, kind of close out the season on a positive note, then they may pass Milwaukee and they may get the 2 seed. They have 3 games against the Bulls. They play Brooklyn. They play the Spurs, but then they also play Boston, Milwaukee, Sacramento, OKC. So they have kind of, I guess, a mixed type of schedule.
Yeah.
So I mean, who knows? So if they can win out those, they may actually be able to move over Milwaukee as the 2 seed, and then if not, 3 seed isn't bad. Because either way, that means if you get out, you're going to play that team in the second round. It's just a matter of home court. And Milwaukee is a better home team than the Knicks, even though the Knicks are good at home.
Yeah, I think the Knicks they do pose a threat if they're healthy. That's the main problem that I think they faced. They faced a lot of adversity this season, but they're back into relevancy, which is amazing. And we already know, New York is considered, the mecca of basketball. So it's only right, considering, this season has been historical. It's only right that they're back in action. But you have to feel great about Brunson. You hope Julius Randle can come back as well. And then their additions as well. I hope they can get consistently healthy too, because I think they're a force to be reckoned with. And I think they're probably the team in the East that's like probably the most likely to get an upset on, somebody if they do, get into a later round or something like that. Because I think, they're going to go beyond the first round. I think, they're not going to be a first round exit. I don't see that. I think, they have too many things going for them for that to happen. But, I think if they do play a higher seed, like, I don't know, Milwaukee or something like that, I think I could see them upset them potentially. It's just a matter of health.
I think this next team, if they're healthy, I think they can play a style of playoff basketball, especially
Yeah.
which we haven't talked about, right? Especially the fact that they kind of stealthily, right, kind of changed how these games are officiated somewhat, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like now all of a sudden, even though we've seen some crazy free throw games, right? There was a stretch for most of March where I think it was like the lowest free throw attempts, you know, like across a bunch of games, over the month, in like 50 plus years, right? I think since the 50s or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's kind of something to think about. And I think the Knicks are a team that is pretty well equipped to handle that style of play because they have a lot of rugged players, a lot of tough guys that can play physical on both ends of the floor, right? We
Mm-hmm.
know they want to play defense. They've been really good, on that end of the floor, right? They've been one of the top defensive teams in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, and again, and then you have a guy in Jalen Brunson where, he's been, an all NBA guy pretty much, the whole season. So if he can, assuming he continues that play into the playoffs, which we saw last year, so we know he can do it, you have a guy you can go to, from start to finish of a game. So that's already, one problem solved. And then if you have the other guys that play off of him, then like you said, that's kind of where you get into a stretch where you can pull off an upset, against the team. Because, I think they went a little further than expected last season, right? Because, most people picked the Cavs and they smashed them in 5 games, right? I
Yeah.
mean, like, it wasn't really close. So, and I think this team, if they're healthy, is probably better than last year's team because I think you have more guys that you probably like on a playoff roster versus last year where you had some really good young talent, but those guys may not necessarily be, they're not at a point yet where I think you can always trust them in a playoff series, right? Like RJ Barrett was pretty good against the Cavs and then started off good against the Heat and then kind of phased out. Whereas I think Anunoby will probably be more comfortable in that setting, especially because he's, you just have also really good shooting
Yeah. And
from
he's
the next team
consistent.
as well. Right? Yeah. Like, I mean, in the starting five, you got Brunson, who's a really good 3-point shooter. DiVincenzo, Anunoby when he's healthy. Randall isn't really a 3-point shooter, but, he can take some of those.
Yeah.
And then even off the bench, right? You have Miles McBride, who was a guy where I'm going to give a big shout out to him. because I didn't necessarily know, that he had all of this in him. I knew, he had played at times, right? But he's
Hmm.
really good for New York. Um, right? And then obviously the trade pieces have been kind of mixed results, right? Like
Yeah.
Bogdanovich has not been that great. Um, I think, if they get healthier, that will probably be better. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of it's because like the defense is not that great in combination of the shots not always going in.
Hmm.
When the shots fall, he'll probably play more. So maybe it's just a slump. And I think, obviously if they get healthier, I think that'll help as well. But they do still have a lot of depth, right? Because then it's like you have Josh Hart, right, who's been starting, but he'll probably go back to the bench and not have to play 48 minutes a game. But, even if he plays like 28 or 35, he can still really impact the game.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of guys that I like, and that's
Even
probably,
DiVincenzo too.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, DiVincenzo starts. So, I
yeah,
mean, if, yeah, I think that's another team where it's like, maybe dark horse. I don't know. I mean, because
that's
like
what I would
I
say.
feel
Yeah.
like Philly and Miami. I don't know if you can really classify them as dark horses because they've been, you know, here before. I mean,
Yeah.
like Miami made the NBA Finals twice. I guess you could say dark horse. Where like I don't think anybody's picking Miami to make a deep run right now.
You're right.
But it's like we've seen them do it before. Like I feel like the New York one would probably be the one where it's like that would be pretty surprising. I guess the Miami one would be too, just because of how they played. But they've already surprised us before, so it's
Yeah.
like if
They
they
wouldn't have the
surprise us,
same factor.
right? Yeah, yeah. So I think that, and also the Knicks one, they've just been better for most of the season,
Yeah.
even without their guys. Like they've still been solid. So I think if they can get the rest of their guys back, that could possibly be a team where it's like, hey, if it's not Milwaukee, who's the next team up? And it may be the Knicks. Because with Philly, I just I don't know. I need Embiid to be healthy because I think Philly does have a lot of pieces. To be fair, right? Because like I know they've been horrible since Embiid's been out, but I feel like it's a lot easier to slot those guys into place if Embiid comes back.
Yeah.
Because then it's like then you can be like, oh, now you have Buddy Hield, who you can do handoffs with Embiid as opposed to him sometimes having to step into and dribble and create his own shot, right? Tyrese Maxey can play off Embiid. Same with like Harris and Oubre. Um, like Mo Bamba isn't starting, so it's like that's why and then like Kyle Lowry's a backup as opposed to a starter. Unless and even some other guys. What was it like? D'Anthony Melton he's just disappeared. I think he had
Yeah.
a back injury, so I think he's I guess it's just been a really awful back injury. Same with Covington, I think as well. Um, so they have a lot of depth as well, but their stuff hinges all on Embiid. It's just
For
like if
sure.
he's not close to what he was, then they don't have a shot. And I think it would be a tough ask, even if they're like a 7-8 seed, to just take out Milwaukee or Philly in round, or not Philly, Boston in round one. I just think that'd be a really tough ask. To
Yeah.
just kind of go in and then play a playoff game. So who knows? But aside from that, I feel like the Knicks may be the next man up.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. And then I guess moving on, Jonte Porter. What the heck? I mean, so
Yeah.
yeah. So he's getting investigated. With betting issues, right? Where basically, what was it like? He sat out, of games, right? And people picked unders, and then they were able to get money from that, basically. So I guess
Well,
they're trying to,
because like
right?
because the way that it came up was he was like performing oddly, like he would try and like get rebounds but then do a bad acting job of it, like the laziest rebounds I think that people have ever seen. And the problem is people were winning so much money on it that I think it was DraftKings, yeah. They're the ones who flagged it to the NBA and were like, people are making an obscene amount of money on this and this is not right. And that's kind of how it got the attention that it has.
Yeah.
And yeah, he was like, and also another thing in that game, the under was under 4 rebounds. He had 3 in the first quarter. He
Yep.
left the game and pointed at his eye injury, but
Yep.
apparently, looking through the footage, and I've seen multiple YouTube videos, everybody's confirmed he was not touched in the eye at all. He left the game
Yeah.
early.
No.
That's what happened, and then
Yeah.
that's what flagged the entire thing.
Yeah. And I think the first time
Hmm.
he kind of got away with it, but I think once it happened the second time, then
Yeah,
it was like, okay,
yeah,
something's not right here. And so, that's a rough spot to be in where it's like, he may get suspended, he may get barred, who knows?
right.
Um, But it kind of advances the conversation about sports betting, right? Because sports betting obviously now is so much more commonplace, and it's there's obviously it's a way to earn money, but it sometimes can kind of be like a weird thing because then you have stuff like this, where it kind of hurts the integrity of the game, right? Because it's a
Hmm.
bad look, for everyone involved, obviously, and that's tough, right? So he may have cost himself a job, in the NBA. He's on a two-way contract, so it's not like he's making a lot of money. So that means you got to be extra careful, right? And then it's like, now Michael Porter Jr. is kind of thrown into this, right? Because Michael Porter Jr. is the older brother,
Yep.
right? I think in one of the post games, he didn't take any questions, right? Because, they didn't want him, I think, to answer any of that
Yeah.
stuff. I think it was a game where he didn't play, if I'm not mistaken,
Hmm.
but I could be wrong.
Hmm.
But either way, yeah, not a great look. And
Yeah.
again, so it's like, what do we do with the sports betting stuff? Because it's like maybe it might be getting out of hand a little bit. I don't sports bet at all,
Me
but I
neither.
know that there are many people who do.
Hmm.
Um, there's always funny stuff, right? Because it's like people lose a lot of money from it. Sometimes people get angry at the players. Sometimes they send out interesting messages,
Yeah.
including death threats. So
Yeah. We've
yeah,
even
so
seen it
I
with
do.
Beal last year, I think,
Yeah,
like
right,
he was confronted and had a whole altercation over a sports bet, which is crazy.
right.
But,
Yeah, so
I think we're in a weird era. I know like years and
yeah,
years ago, the NBA was one of the pioneering sports in bringing sports betting to light. Before it was kind of a shady deal, illegal, but, ever since it's become legal in most states, the NBA has been for sure like, one of the top sports that is bet on.
right.
But this is a odd case, and I'm sure, if it's true, I'm gonna like say that he was probably
Allegation,
targeted. Yeah, if the allegations are true, then he was probably targeted due to his salary. Like you said, he's on a two-way contract, so he's not making, the most money, that an NBA player can possibly make. So, he's probably was making a decent chunk off of this scam or whatever you want to call it. But I don't want to get into that. It's more so of like, what if a player of bigger stature does this? Because what is the NBA going to do to send a message? Are they going to toss him? Are they going to suspend him? What are they going to do? Like, is he going to get barred from the NBA? Because then, if he's barred, then the next player who does it is also going to have to be barred and suspended, thrown out, whatever. So they have to set the precedent here, and I'm curious to see, what that's going to be if, the
right.
investigation comes to light, and then we find out that he actually was a part of the gambling investigation or whatever. But
Right.
it's tough. Like you said, sports betting, it has its positives and it definitely has its negatives. It brings a lot of eyes to the game that may not be there all the time. But like you said, the negatives, they're showing their heads right now, and it can get pretty ugly. So it is what it is.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
hope he didn't do it, man. It does hurt the integrity of the game, like you said, and take
Right.
something away from it.
Right. I guess the precedent, I guess, is in football, right? Where they basically, what did they do? They suspended players for like the whole season, right?
Yeah, yeah. Like I think it depended on how much they were doing or like the varying amounts or whatever. But like, yeah,
Right.
you as a player, you just shouldn't really be into gambling, in terms of sports betting, gambling. Like, you can do
Yeah.
whatever you want with your own money in terms of, as long as it's not the sport that you play in. Like, don't bet on yourself, literally.
Yeah.
It's not good,
And
bro.
then, yeah, and then you had what Shohei Otani, right? His
Yeah,
translator or
bro.
whatever. His,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
there's questions about that too. Like, they're saying that's the classic play where the friend takes the fall for the star rich guy. And then, but Otani keeps a private life. Like, and we're not a baseball podcast, so you guys might not even know who we're talking about. But yeah, wild
yeah. This is
situation.
off.
But sports gambling is real. That's all it
Yeah,
comes down to. It's still a form of
yeah. This
gambling,
isn't.
and there's nasty things about gambling.
Yeah, this isn't off base takes. This is
Yeah,
off ball takes.
yeah,
But
this off base. Oh my
um,
god.
but either way, yeah. So it is going to be intriguing to see what the NBA does. What the
Mm-hmm.
fallout is, because again, like you said, it sets an example, for the
Yeah.
rest of the league, right? 'Cause it's like, if he gets suspended for a little bit, right, then that's one thing. If it's like a year-long suspension, I don't think it's a ban. I feel like it's probably just going to be like a suspension. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, you know, I mean, I could be wrong, but I feel like it's not going to be that. But I guess it also just depends on, obviously, like you said, what happens. So
Yeah, because the problem is he's not a star. He's more of a fringe player where, he gets minutes here and there. But if it was a star, it'd be a complete different conversation. So like you said, I am very curious to see what the outcome of this is. And it is unfortunate that it's even happening.
yeah, and then wrapping up with a couple other stories around the league, right? So we got, Dan Gilbert, right, the Cavs team governor. He's confident that Donovan Mitchell will sign an extension. He was
Hmm.
talking to the Associated Press. And he basically said, quote, we've been talking to him, sure, for the last couple of years about extension. We think he will extend. I think if you listen to him talk, he loves the city. Uh, he loves the
Bless you.
situation in Cleveland because our players are very young and we're just kind of putting the core
Bless you.
together that he's clearly, thank you, the biggest part of. So interesting. I mean, I guess that's the guy who owns the team, right? So obviously, I don't think he's going to say no way he doesn't sign, but
Right.
it is kind of an interesting backdrop with Cleveland. I mean, to be fair, like Cleveland's been good. So, and it doesn't really feel like that there's like an obvious destination for him to go if it doesn't pan out because it's like, with what the Knicks are building, I don't know if it makes as much sense to get Donovan Mitchell anymore. And then it's like Brooklyn's a mess, so it's like I wouldn't want to go there. Um, and then after that, like where else? You know what I mean? So it's like it wouldn't, at this point it feels, and I think like because people were talking about does Donovan Mitchell get traded? I think before the deadline, and I think both of us thought he would stay a Cav.
Hmm.
I think we were just questioning whether or not he extends. Do you have a gut feeling that he signs an extension or like
Hmm.
stays in Cleveland, or do you still think he probably leaves? Because I guess like my thing is I just don't know where else he would end up going,
Hmm.
unless it's like he asked for a trade elsewhere. Because it's like again, teams that have cap, at least as of right now, I mean, they're not teams you would want to go to. And either way, he's not a free agent for a little bit, right? Because I think
Yeah.
he has the player option, I think, in what is it, 2026. So he still has, 2 seasons before, he can decide.
Yeah, it's a weird situation. I wish, we were talking about this and this story came up, after we kind of see what Cleveland does in the playoffs, because I think it might be contingent on that. This is a guy that has kind of, I think we know that he's a really good player. Just he's been on he's been on the unfortunate side of history where he's lost a lot in the playoffs, and that's kind of been the story of his career, unfortunately. But I think if they find some success in the playoffs, then I think we could probably say, yeah, he's going to sign the extension. Because I think, the owner is right. They are building something special. You have a great young core of guys where, Mobley seems to be, pretty good. You got Jared Allen, you got Darius Garland. Like, that's a competent starting five, especially in the East. Like, that's one where you're going to be in the playoffs every year. It's just a matter of how far can you go and are you actually going to win when you do get to the playoffs. But right now, I would say, yeah, he's probably going to sign an extension. It all depends on the playoff.
Yeah. Yeah, he's extension eligible in July.
Yeah.
So he has the player option if he declines it in 2025
Okay.
for the 2025-2026 season. So I guess like at the end of next season he could opt out.
Got it.
But still, like either way, I mean, yeah, I feel like he may get it. I think he's
Right.
you can't get the supermax right because he was traded from Utah to Cleveland, so he can
Right.
still get an extension, just not a supermax one. But either way, um, I don't know. Yeah, but I feel like he's probably gonna just at least as of right now, maybe stay in Cleveland. It just
Yeah.
kind of depends on what like you said what Cleveland does because if
Right.
they get past the first round and show some more growth, then you probably would feel a little bit more inclined to stay because it's like, as of right now, it's his team, and if he gets them past the first round, right, then like that's probably better for him than if it's like he's on another team where he's not like the number one option. And it's like I guess you give him credit for helping out a team like if he gets traded to whomever, but I think right now is a good spot for him. I think where Cleveland right now makes sense. It's just a matter of like, I do think with Cleveland, you do have enough like of a good core where I think if you traded him and got back like decent pieces, you wouldn't be in a horrible spot because it's like you have Garland, you have Mobley, you have Allen,
Mm-hmm.
and if you did move Mitchell and you got back something for him, right? Whether it be like, expiring contracts and picks or um, whatever it would be, I think you'd feel okay. You know what I mean? Like obviously, like the ceiling may be a little lower, but like they do have some other really good players. But
Yeah.
I think like you said, it just kind of comes down to what they do in the postseason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Minnesota, right? Seems like the ownership is gonna just stay, right? I think it was
Yeah.
what is it, Glenn Taylor, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the guy that's been owning Minnesota for a while. I guess he's just gonna have his majority stake. I guess A Rod and the other guys, I guess they ran out of time in terms of like whatever payment they had to make.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess they're not gonna own it, which is kind of
Yeah.
interesting. Because I think there was a lot of hype about the new ownership because I think most people had been pretty low on Taylor's ownership because he's owned them, I think, for a pretty long time at this point. So he was kind of there during the ugly stretches for Minnesota.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot of hype, and I guess I think, these two guys, right? They were also kind of behind prying Connolly from the Nuggets. So, that's kind of a weird spot to be in, but we'll see where this goes.
Yeah, and I mean, like, because the minority owners would be A Rod and Mark Lore. So I'm assuming like he's not going to be
Yeah,
selling it, which is kind of
yeah,
wild, I guess.
yeah. He gets his majority stake, and they have to keep their minority stake, so they have 40%,
So it's still
and they
all a
would.
conglomerate, though.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
just like, yeah, but what it would have been is they would have had 80, and he would
okay,
have had like, so they would have been like the big majority
yeah, yeah.
owners. But,
Okay, got you. Yeah, I mean
but now,
that kind of sucks. I mean, I would wonder, why he did it.
yeah, I mean,
I guess it might be like seller's remorse. I don't know,
yeah,
but it could be
according,
disruptive, to the team, honestly, and to like the entire morale, of the fans and whatnot. Because this is a historic season for them. I think this is what their first 50
50
win
wins
season.
in
Yeah, in
20
20
years.
years. It's a big deal, and to kind of
Yeah,
have it your parade rained on by your owner just being a sourpuss is kind of wild to me.
yeah. I mean, it sounds like a lot of it was kind of like apparently their relationship has kind of disintegrated.
Mm,
Um, apparently, he says that they failed to reach a lot of key benchmarks in the purchase agreement. I mean, they submitted some documentation that they thought, that they had it. So, I
okay.
don't know. I mean, but I guess the good news is that I hope, I would assume it's not going to hopefully affect the players. Because they're, I would think, pretty laser focused on the season.
Yeah.
Of course, they may have some ramifications in the off season, right? Because they're going to have to make some decisions about what they do with their roster.
Yeah.
Even though they do have a president of basketball operations, right? But the owner oftentimes in these, in these situations, does make the final call in terms of like, do I really want to pay for this roster, um, or whatever. So
Yeah.
hopefully that doesn't hopefully that's not like a bad sign for Minnesota this season where it's like, they just have like a really disappointing first round exit again. And then like, all the enthusiasm and all the hype, that's gone into the season so far just comes crashing down.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really, this is never really a good sign, I don't think.
No, and it's like, sorry to switch gears in sports, but like as a Washington Commanders fan, trust me, like when ownership gets involved and ownership kind of is talked about a little bit more than the team itself and the players and what they're doing on the field, it can creep in and seep into the players' mindsets and they can get distracted. So trust me, I understand what's at stake here, and you don't want to have this happen. It's never a good sign, like you said.
No. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, having great ownership, is a big advantage, for a lot of these teams
Hmm.
because, again, they're the ones that cash the checks. And, if they, make the right decisions in terms of getting the right people, that can make a huge difference. Obviously, sometimes you can just have a great player that can kind of overcome it. But it would be ideal to have both, I
Yeah.
would say. So, we'll see what happens, with this, but not really great for Minnesota, I don't
Mm-mm.
think. That's pretty
Horrible.
unfortunate. Yeah, so yeah, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know in the comments, your thoughts, on all the things going on so far in terms of the standings, in terms of, the race for, all of these spots in the playoffs, as the regular season comes to a really thrilling conclusion and close, and hopefully we get an even more exciting postseason. And then, also let us know about, the sports gambling, Jonte Porter stuff, and everything else we discussed. Again, we're past 50 subs, right? So we have a goal of getting to 100. So, if you can help us out by liking the video, subscribing. If you comment at the end, we will read your comment at the beginning of, the video. So, keep those comments, kind of rolling in because we got a few, on the last one. We read one out in the
Yeah.
previous episode. So I guess, we'll see you on Monday.